These buildings defy gravity, logic, and in some cases, common sense, clinging to cliffs, balancing on stilts, or swaying hundreds of feet in the air with nothing but blind faith and brittle wood. Today's video, I'm gonna count down 15 crazy structures that shouldn't be standing. Let's start with number 15, the Leaning Tower of Husen, Germany. In the quiet village of Husen in Lower Saxony, Germany, stands a church tower that's dramatically tilted. It beats even the Leaning Tower of Pisa in terms of angle, yet few outside of Northern Europe even know it exists. This Leaning Tower is not a tourist magnet or UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a 15th century church tower that looks like it's moments away from collapsing. And by all logic, it probably should have. Standing at just 27 meters or about 89 feet, this modest structure tilts at an astonishing 5.19 degrees. That's more than Pisa's 3.97. That makes it the most tilted tower in the world that was never intentionally designed to lean like that. It was originally constructed in the 13th century as part of a Gothic brick church complex. This tower was added around 1450. And at the time the region was swampland, and the builders, confident in the marshy soil stability, drove oak tree trunks into the ground as foundational support. This early form of timber piling was common across Northern Europe, as wood buried in oxygen-free soil doesn't rot. However, over the centuries the water table in the area began to drop, and this exposed the wooden foundations to the air. As the supports weakened, one side of the tower began to settle unevenly. By the 1990s, the tilt had reached a critical point and the tower was closed to the public. At that point, most experts believed the tower was going to collapse. Structural simulations showed that continued stress on the outer walls and the tower's lean was increasing by millimeters per year. However, unlike Pisa, their tower had no international fundraising campaign or massive engineering effort to halt the damage. Instead, a relatively small stabilization project was undertaken in 1995, which involved anchoring the foundation with deep concrete and steel pilings. The tilt was preserved, not corrected, and the movement was slowed. But despite all this, the church there is still in use. Locals continue to have services beneath this tilted spire, and because the region sees little seismic activity, the risk of a sudden collapse is considered pretty low. The tower entered the Guinness Book of World Records in 2007 as the most tilted tower on Earth, finally unseating Pisa. But due to its small size and its remote location, it does remain under the radar. There are no long lines, no tour guides, just a handful of tourists quietly marveling at the fact that this odd, crazy brick needle is still standing at all. It shouldn't be, and yet it is. Number 14, the Dancing House in the Czech Republic. Overlooking the Vltava River is a building so warped, so delightfully off balance, that it looks like it's going to topple over from a strong gust of wind. The Dancing House is one of the most controversial and iconic pieces of architecture in Eastern Europe. It's a postmodernist structure that appears to sway, bend, and twist right in the middle of a historically Baroque and Art Nouveau district. The building was completed in 1996 after years of public debate and engineering uncertainty. Its full name at inception was Fred and Ginger. That was a nod to famed dancers Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And once you see it, the reference does kinda click. The structure is designed to resemble a pair of dancers, with one tower, straight, clean, and classic, representing Fred, and the other curving, glassy, and spiraling, embodying Ginger mid-twirl. Now, the building really shouldn't be able to stand in its present form. The twisting glass tower features no right angles. It's curved inward like a waist, sloping away from the base in a manner that looks structurally unstable. The concrete floors of both towers are irregular, supported by a central core, but cantilevered in every direction. Frank Gehry, the designer himself, admitted that the only way to make the building viable was to hand the geometry over to computer modeling systems capable of calculating stress loads in real time. That was a novel concept in the early 1990s. The design also had to reckon with the site, an oddly shaped, highly visible lot that had been vacant since World War II. But the execution was technically terrifying. The frame of the Dancing House uses 99 individually shaped concrete panels, each with different angles and dimensions to support the twisting form. Steel beams were installed inside the walls to create that swaying effect of the facade, and the glass skirt of Ginger's tower uses curved and tensioned pieces, some of which bulge outward beyond the vertical line of the building. Well, many critics said it was never going to stand, that it was impractical, that it would leak, warp, crack, and yet almost 30 years later, it's done none of those things. Part of the genius of the design lies in how it cheats gravity. The apparent imbalance is an illusion. It's a masterclass in load distribution and hidden support systems. The glass tower looks like it's leaning, but much of the support comes from a hidden reinforced concrete spine that runs through the back. The steel mesh crown at the top, nicknamed Medusa, adds to the illusion of motion, though it serves no structural function. The dancing house was met with fierce resistance during its planning phase. Prague's preservationists were aghast at the idea of placing a warped modernist structure right next to a 19th century facade. Public outcry was intense, and yet today the building is not only accepted, it's loved. And it stands as a bold statement that beauty can come from imbalance, that structure doesn't have to be static. And yet when you walk around it, or better yet when you view it from above, a part of you still whispers, this shouldn't be possible, right? Number 13, the Millennium Tower in San Francisco. In San Francisco's South of Market, or SoMa district, is a luxury skyscraper that was supposed to symbolize wealth, stability, and modern architectural confidence. Instead, it's become a global case study in how quickly prestige can turn to peril. This is the Millennium Tower, a 58-story, 645-foot tall high-rise that since opening in 2009 has been quietly and terrifyingly sinking and tilting. The problem emerged slowly. By 2015, residents began to notice that their floors were sloping and their windows weren't closing properly. The building had already sunk more than 16 inches into the ground and had begun tilting to the northwest. By 2023, that tilt reached over 29 inches at the top, with one side of the building nearly 2 feet lower than the other. In technical terms, the tower had developed a differential settlement. That means the building wasn't settling straight downwards, it was doing so unevenly. But the Millennium Tower isn't 55 meters tall like Pisa, it's twice that height and built in an earthquake-prone city. So how did this happen? Well, the root of the problem lies in its foundation design. Rather than anchoring the structure into San Francisco's bedrock that's about 200 feet beneath the surface, developers opted for a matte slab foundation supported by 80-foot-long concrete friction piles embedded in dense sand layers. This wasn't uncommon at that time, but critics pointed out that other nearby high-rises use deep pile foundations that reached all the way to the bedrock. When the adjacent Salesforce Transit Center was constructed beginning in 2010, involving deep soil excavation and dewatering, it appears to have accelerated the tower's sinking. Owners sued those developers, and the developers blamed the city, and the city pointed fingers at everyone else. Meanwhile, the residents of the tower were living in a real-world disaster in slow motion. Then, in 2016, a shocking discovery. The building was leaning faster than expected, and some of the piles had already lost effective load-bearing capacity. The city convened emergency engineering panels, and public confidence evaporated. What had been a $350 million triumph was becoming a $100 million catastrophe. To stabilize the building, a plan was approved in 2020. Drive 52 new steel piles down to bedrock along the tower's north and west sides in the direction of the lean. These would act as anchors to slow, stop, or even reverse the tilt. However, installation of these piles was halted multiple times due to quote-unquote unintended consequences. The process itself caused more sinking. Engineers then reduced the number of piles to 18, calling it a shortened solution that would stabilize the building without worsening the lean. As of 2023, though, the fix appears to be working. The building's lean has been modestly reduced. But from a legal and financial standpoint, the saga is ongoing. Insurance claims, class action lawsuits, and investor losses continue to swirl. The tower's reputation is permanently stained. Once it was the crown jewel of the SoMa skyline, the Millennium Tower is now viewed with a mix of curiosity and dread. It is, in every sense, a structure that shouldn't be standing, and yet it is for now. Number 12, the Hangan Temple in China. Clinging to a vertical cliff face 75 meters above the canyon floor, the Hangan Temple of Mount Heng in China's Shanxi province seems to hover. It's a miraculous feat of ancient engineering that even modern architects find difficult to explain. It was constructed more than 1,500 years ago and supported by nothing more than timber beams driven into sheer rock, yet it's endured earthquakes, floods, and time itself. What makes the structure so astonishing isn't just that vertical placement, it's the fact that half the building is suspended in open air, supported by long wooden stilts. Visitors reach the temple by climbing narrow, winding staircases that wrap around the cliff, and once inside, you're met with dizzying drop-offs. The temple itself was built in the late 5th century during the Northern Wei dynasty by a single monk named Lao Ran, who sought solitude in the mountains. What's remarkable is that the bulk of the structure, over 40 rooms interconnected by wooden corridors and ladders, was added without any mechanical assistance. The beams were hammered into the cliff by hand, supported by hidden rock columns inside the structure that bear most of the load. Engineers studying the temple have pointed out that the location is uniquely strategic. The overhanging rock protects it from rain, while its elevated position saves it from floods. The vertical beams that appear to support the structure are only partly load-bearing. The real support lies inside the cliff itself, where deep mortises in the stone lock the beams in place. Still though, deterioration is a threat. Wood rot, temperature fluctuations, and tourist foot traffic have taken a toll. The government there has invested heavily in preservation, including installing seismic sensors, applying weatherproofing treatments, and limiting access during peak seasons. Despite those efforts, many experts believe that the temple's days are numbered. The natural erosion of the cliff face could eventually weaken the beam sockets. A major earthquake could dislodge entire sections, and the dry, cracked wood of some of the original beams has already shown signs of fatigue. And yet, the temple remains. And in 2010, the Time magazine named it one of the world's most dangerous buildings. Yet still, pilgrims visit, monks still pray, and tourists still marvel at its precarious beauty. Hanging there, somewhere between gravity and grace, this temple is a defiance of common sense. It's like a sacred paradox. Number 11. The Mitora Monasteries in Greece. The sandstone pillars of central Greece are like castles that were dropped from the sky. The monasteries of Mitora are some of the most improbable structures ever built. Perched on top of towering rock spires, some of them over 400 meters, 1,300 feet tall, these medieval Orthodox sanctuaries seem less like buildings and more like miracles. The word Meteora means suspended in the air, and that's exactly how the 6 remaining monasteries appear, floating above the Thessalian plain, seemingly immune to time, gravity, or even erosion. They were constructed not just in difficult terrain, but in actively crumbling terrain. The sandstone pinnacles they rest on are geologically unstable, shaped over millions of years by earthquakes, floods, and wind. And yet here, on these ephemeral towers of rock, monks built stone sanctuaries. The origins of the monastic life here date back to the 9th century. By the 14th century, growing Ottoman invasions prompted ascetic monks to climb higher, literally, and seek solitude in the heavens. The first actual monastery, the Great Meteoron, was founded around 1344 by Saint Athanasios, who scaled the rock formations and declared them divinely chosen. What followed was one of the most daring acts of religious architecture in history. With no cranes, roads, or access points, the monks and locals used wooden scaffolds, hand-chiseled grooves, and rudimentary winches to haul building materials up. For hundreds of years, the only access to these monasteries was by climbing a rope ladder or being pulled up in a basket suspended on a pulley system. Now, the baskets weren't metaphors, they were literally just woven baskets that were lowered by hand from the cliff tops. Visitors and supplies were hoisted vertically, dangling in midair. One famous legend says a visitor once asked how often the rope was replaced, and the monk replied, "When the Lord lets it break." The risk wasn't just in the ascent. The monasteries themselves were built directly on the stone without flat foundations. Floors were leveled using stone fill, walls were curved to match the contour of the rock, and rain runoff, lightning strikes, and temperature swings had to be accounted for. Well, tourism now brings in hundreds of thousands of people each year, prompting UNESCO to designate this place a World Heritage Site in 1988. There are few other places on Earth where humans will be tested so vertically. The Meteora monasteries are simply not old, nor simply high. They're perched on the very edge of what architecturally is possible, the balance between divine faith and structural genius. They were never supposed to last this long. The rock was too fragile, the building conditions too extreme, and yet they remain. Number 10. The Gateway Arch in Missouri. So at first glance, the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri seems too smooth, too balanced, too perfect to be dangerous. But behind that gleaming stainless steel curve is one of the most complex structural balancing acts in architectural history. Standing 630 feet or 192 meters up into the sky, taller than the Statue of Liberty, the Washington Monument, or the Space Needle, the arch is the tallest arch in the world and the tallest man-made monument in the Western Hemisphere. And yet, it's completely hollow inside. It balances solely on two narrow, outward curving legs. And by all accounts, it shouldn't be standing. It was conceived as a monument to the westward expansion of the United States. Its clean, modernist form, a perfect inverted catenary curve, belied the enormous difficulty of actually building it. Construction began in 1963 and it finished in '65, but in that span of time, more than 100 major structural crises threatened to derail it. Why? Because the arch isn't just tall, it's unsupported. There are no internal columns, no external bracing. It stands entirely by geometric integrity and the precision of assembly. The arch is constructed from carbon steel on the inside and 304 stainless steel on the outside, over 886 tons of metal, yet the walls are less than 3/8 of an inch thick in many places. Each leg was built separately from massive prefabricated triangular sections rising one after the other on opposite sides of the lawn. But they couldn't just meet up at the top, they had to do it exactly within 1/64 of an inch or the arch would never close. That final closure, inserting the keystone section, was a feat of audacity. Workers labored 630 feet in open air, aligning steel sections under tension and high wind. The two legs swayed several inches during construction, leading engineers to monitor temperature and wind with obsessive precision. But once sealed up, the arch became kind of a structural paradox. It's stiffer than most bridges, and yet it can sway up to 18 inches in high wind. Its foundation, buried 60 feet underground, has to absorb both vertical load and lateral tension. And there is no building inside of it, just staircases, emergency hatches, and a tiny little tram system that carries visitors in pill-shaped pods to the viewing platform at the top. And here's the terrifying part. The arch has no escape route from the top. In an emergency, the only way down is through the tram, which can take up to 45 minutes to clear during full occupancy. If there's a power failure, visitors are stranded at 630 feet in a steel tube with no ventilation system. The monument is constantly monitored, with laser equipment and seismic detectors installed in the foundations, and engineers believe it's safe, for now. But even they admit, had one piece been misaligned by a fraction of an inch, the whole thing could have collapsed inward like a metal skeleton folding onto itself. It shouldn't be standing, and yet it gleams, unshakably, impossibly smooth, a 20th century exclamation point suspended against the sky. Number 9. The Lotus Tower in Sri Lanka. Above the congested skyline of Colombo, rising like a futuristic flower from another world, the Lotus Tower is Sri Lanka's tallest man-made structure, and one of the most improbable. At 356 meters, or 1,168 feet tall, it's not just a skyscraper or a communications tower, it is a massive concrete and steel bloom balancing on a stalk. This gleaming spire should be a monument to engineering, but for years it was considered a failure in the making, a structure that many believed would never be completed, and even if it was, would never stand. At the heart of this controversy wasn't just the tower's peculiar design, but the unconventional construction timeline. Construction began in 2012 and it was supposed to finish within 3 years, but delays, political disputes, design changes, and of course funding irregularities plagued the project from the start. By 2019, only portions of the tower were usable, despite the fact the entire massive flower-shaped upper section, housing restaurants, viewing decks, and telecommunications equipment, had already been perched nearly 1,000 feet above the city. Why did it seem doomed? Well, the building was an enormous structure with a top-heavy center of mass, supported by a narrow concrete shaft in a humid, corrosion-prone environment. The foundation is anchored into the clay and sand of Colombo's soil, and it's stabilized by deep concrete piles, yet the load-bearing calculations required to support the asymmetrical design, with its flared top, extreme height, and exposure to typhoon wind, remain one of the most mathematically complex ever attempted in South Asia. There, of course, were multiple construction halts due to cracks forming at stress points between the Lotus structure and the central point, and others said the foundation pilings were driven too deep into water-saturated soil, risking long-term instability. Well, despite the concerns, the Lotus Tower was officially declared complete and opened in 2022. It's got that revolving restaurant, an observation deck, multiple floors of rental space, and yet many areas remain underutilized or empty. Today, the tower stands, not gracefully, but really more defiantly. Engineers continue to monitor that vertical alignment with lasers. Microseismic sensors feed data into an underground control center, and every few months, thermal expansion and contraction produce slight movements in the Lotus petals, enough to make casual visitors feel uneasy on windy days. It's beautiful, it's bizarre, and it's almost abandoned. But against all odds, the Lotus Tower is still there, standing on a marsh, carrying the weight of ambition, politics, and gravity on its narrow concrete shoulders. Number 8. The Vupatal Suspension Railway in Germany. So, hanging trains, yeah, they don't seem like something that should work, and yet in the German city of Vupatal, an entire public transport system hangs from steel rails. This is the Vupatal Schwebebahn, the world's oldest and only suspended monorail of its kind, and perhaps the most surreal mass transit system. It's operated continuously since 1901, and against all expectations, it's not only survived, but it's thrived, transporting millions of people dangling above the streets. What makes it such an unlikely survivor is the combination of age, exposure, and design risk. It was built at the tail end of the 19th century. The system was envisioned as a solution for a growing industrial city with no room for surface rail. Engineer Eugen Langen proposed something radical. Instead of building rail lines on the ground or elevated platforms, suspend the trains from above. The concept did work, barely. The railway's entire structure is a monobeam track suspended on tall iron trestles, with the cars hanging down from the beam that ride underneath. But what makes it feel impossible is how fragile it all looks, especially given that nearly 2/3 of the 13-kilometer route runs directly over water. That means the railway is suspended not over stable ground, but above the Vupa River, crossing it dozens of times. And it also has no redundant track system. Unlike other metro networks, the Schwebebahn is a single-line system with no parallel route. A break or damage to the rail shuts down the entire thing. It's a structure that requires daily and obsessive maintenance. That's perfect in Germany. Inspectors ride the route every morning, checking every bolt, weld, and beam. Any fracture or warp must be corrected immediately. Well, it survived both world wars, multiple floods, and a 1999 accident where a maintenance clamp was accidentally left on the track, causing a train to derail and fall into the river. The only major fatal crash in over a century of operation. Still though, the visual of it, especially for first-time passengers, is pretty unnerving. The cars sway gently in the wind, and on curves they lean outward, mimicking an aircraft. Critics once predicted it would collapse within decades due to corrosion or structural fatigue, but the Schwebebahn continues to carry over 80,000 people a day. Children ride it to school, commuters read the paper, tourists take photos. It's become not just viable, but vital. And yet for over a century, in the drizzle of West Germany, with rust in the air and the river surging below, it still stands. Moving on to number 7, the Kalyazin Bell Tower in Russia. Sticking out of the Volga River like a ghost from another century, the Kalyazin Bell Tower is a surreal structure in Russia. It's a 174-foot-tall, 53-meter church spire standing alone in the middle of a reservoir. With no surrounding church, no cathedral walls, and no congregation in sight, the tower appears to float, half submerged, defying both nature and history. By all reasonable expectations, it should have collapsed decades ago, and yet it still holds fast. Built in the early 19th century, the bell tower was originally part of the Monastery of St Nicholas, a religious complex constructed in the town of Kalyazin. This riverside town, located between Moscow and St. Petersburg, thrived for centuries as a hub of trade and monastic life. But in the 1930s, everything changed. Under Joseph Stalin's regime, the Soviet Union undertook a series of massive hydroelectric projects aimed at electrifying the nation. One of these was the construction of the Urlik Reservoir, which would require the deliberate flooding of a vast lowland area. When the waters began to rise in 1939, the central district, including ancient monasteries, churches, and homes, was gradually flooded. But the bell tower was spared, both for symbolic and practical reasons. Incredibly, the tower didn't sink, its stone foundation anchored deep into the soil and reinforced by rubble fill. Within weeks, it had become an island, a solitary spire surrounded by the artificial lake, and there it's remained for more than 80 years. In recent times, the bell tower has become a symbol of lost history, religious endurance, and the strange legacy of Soviet progress. Tourists visit by boat to walk along the base, and Orthodox priests occasionally perform blessings on floating platforms nearby. But the town of Kalyazin, now relocated up the hill, has embraced the tower as its icon. It appears on postcards, stamps, and currency, and even locals who pass by daily admit that, yeah, it doesn't look real. It's a building not just forgotten by time, but submerged by it. Number 6. The Monastery of St George. Clinging to a sheer rock wall is one of the most isolated and gravity-defying structures in the Middle East. It lies between Jerusalem and Jericho in the West Bank. This 6th century Greek Orthodox monastery looks less like a building and more like a hallucination. No road reaches it, no modern vehicle can get near it, and yet for nearly 1,500 years it's remained perched in place, unmoved by earthquakes, unbowed by time. The monastery was founded around 420 CE by hermit monks fleeing the distractions of Byzantine life in pursuit of solitude and prayer. But over time, as pilgrims began to visit, more and more monks joined the order, and the structure grew outward, not upward. With no flat land to build on, monks had to attach chapels, dormitories, and balconies directly into the cliff. What emerged was a multi-tiered monastic complex embedded like a shelf into the gorge, part cave, part building, part miracle. And it's barely changed since. The entrance is through a footbridge that crosses over a narrow crevasse, leading to a steep carved staircase that descends along the cliff face. Everything needed, food, water, supplies, has to be carried in by hand or by donkey, often up hundreds of steps in the heat. So how's it still standing? Well, the answer lies in the combination of natural protection and architectural adaptation. The monastery is partially sheltered by a rock overhang. Its external walls are reinforced with layers of stone and replastered by hand every few decades. But still, the monastery looks like it's about to fall off the wall. Cracks form between retaining terraces, rainfall occasionally seeps through the cave ceilings, and pieces of stone have been known to tumble down from the canyon walls above. And yet, it holds. Its survival's not guaranteed. In a single landslide, an earthquake, or even a failed retaining beam, parts of it could collapse into the gorge. But it hasn't, and that's what makes it extraordinary. Not just that it was built, but that it's still alive. Number 5. The Temple of Ramses II in Egypt. Carved over 3,200 years ago into a sandstone cliff, the Great Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel is one of the most astonishing feats of ancient architecture, not just because of the colossal statues, but because it no longer stands where it was originally built. Today, this massive monument appears firmly embedded into the mountainside overlooking Lake Nasser in southern Egypt. But in truth, it was cut into pieces, moved, and reassembled in the 1960s. The original temple was constructed during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II around 1264 BCE. Inside, a complex series of halls, pillars, chambers, and sanctuaries was aligned with such precision that twice a year, sunlight would reach the innermost sanctuary and illuminate the statues of the gods. For over 3 millennia, the temple stood mostly forgotten, partially buried, and it was rediscovered in 1813 by Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt and excavated in the following decades. But its very survival came under threat in the mid-20th century with the construction of the Aswan High Dam, an ambitious project to control Nile flooding. The dam would create Lake Nasser, one of the world's largest man-made reservoirs, and Abu Simbel was directly in the flood zone. Faced with the imminent submersion of one of Egypt's most treasured ancient sites, a global rescue effort was launched. The entire complex, including the Great Temple and the adjacent smaller Temple of Hathor, was cut into over 1,000 individual blocks, each weighing between 10 and 30 tons. The reconstruction of it had to be exact, down to the millimeter. The internal axis of the temple had to preserve and maintain the solar alignment. Every wall carving, every pillar, every hieroglyph had to be positioned identically. Even the cracks and imperfections in the original stone were matched to ensure authenticity. It took 4 years and over 2,000 people with assistance from 50 countries. Even engineers at the time expressed doubt that the relocation would hold. The sandstone was fragile, many blocks were cracked or weathered, and the internal chambers were susceptible to stress fractures during assembly. But somehow, it held. More than 50 years later, the structure remains stable. It seems nearly invisible, though, its astronomical alignment still flawless. Against the odds, it was spared by the water of Lake Nasser and reassembled stone by stone, like a colossal puzzle. It should have been lost, but it wasn't. Number 4. The Hanging Houses of Quanka in Spain. On the very edge of a limestone cliff, the Casas Colgadas, or the hanging houses of Cuenca, seem to hover above a gorge of the Huecar River like something out of a fairy tale or a nightmare. These homes, originally built between the 14th and 15th centuries, are among the oldest surviving examples of vertically suspended domestic architecture in Europe, and by all rights, they shouldn't still be standing. The city of Cuenca, located in central Spain, was founded during the Moorish occupation in the early 8th century. Its location, atop a rocky outcrop flanked by deep river gorges, made it nearly impregnable to invaders. But what made Cuenca secure also made it inaccessible, and by the late Middle Ages, space within the city walls was scarce, and the only place to build was outward over the cliffs. Thus were born the hanging houses, multi-storied dwellings partially dug into the rock with rear facades extending straight out into thin air. But practical or not, the result is pretty astonishing. Stone and timber homes teetering on the brink of oblivion. Cuenca, fortunately, is still relatively dry, and the cold winters and hot summers have hardened the wood rather than rotted it, and still engineers have long warned that any significant earth movement or prolonged saturation could destabilize the entire cliffside. Reinforcement work began in the early 1920s with major restorations in the 60s and 1990s. Modern steel rods now strengthen the joists visibly, and microsensors monitor any shift in the cliff face. Even locals refer to the houses as if they're alive, groaning, aging, enduring. In stormy weather, the balconies sway. In droughts, the cracks widen. But they still stand. Barely. Number 3. The Takasugion Tea House in Japan. In Chino, Nagano Prefecture, it looks less like a place to drink tea and more like a dare. Suspended 6 meters, 20 feet off the ground, and accessible only by a rickety vertical ladder, this surreal one-room structure seems as though it could topple from a breeze, an earthquake, or even a strong cough. It's not just precarious, it is almost philosophically impossible. Built in 2004 by Japanese architect Tenorobu Fujimori, the name Takasugion literally translates to "too tall tea house," a self-deprecating nod to its absurd height. It was constructed using ancient Japanese carpentry techniques, traditional plasterwork, hand-cut cedar, and hand-charred siding. No steel framing, no anchors into bedrock, and no visible structural reinforcements. So how is it still standing? Well, this tea house sits on top of 2 mature chestnut trees that were cut down, stripped, and replanted vertically in concrete-filled footings. Their rootless trunks now act as natural support columns. The tea room itself is a narrow cedar box with small windows, traditional tatami mats, and a simple alcove for hanging scrolls. A single small chimney protrudes from the side to vent a kettle stove, and everything has to be carried up by hand. The climb itself, up a vertical ladder, is enough to dissuade the uncommitted. The point, Fujimori says, is to separate the drinker from the world. To ascend is to disconnect, to meditate, to isolate, to destabilize. But the physical destabilization is real. The ladder creaks, the structure sways gently in the wind, and earthquakes are common here, yet the Takasugion has survived more than a dozen seismic events. But despite its delicate appearance, this tea house has become one of Japan's most admired architectural oddities. That it's still standing more than 20 years later with minimal maintenance and zero renovations is astonishing. And that it was ever allowed to be built, let alone inhabited, borders on miraculous. It is by every definition a structure that should not be standing, and yet it does, for now, quietly floating above the forest like an idea that refuses to come down. Number 2. The Umeda Sky Building in Japan. In the heart of Osaka, the Umeda Sky Building is one of the most bizarre skyscrapers, and quite possibly one of the most structurally absurd ones still standing. It's composed of 2 40-story towers connected at the top by a massive floating observatory. The building looks more like a suspension bridge made of glass and steel than a stable skyscraper. And yet, somehow, despite multiple earthquakes, the building continues to stand, even though most engineers agree it probably shouldn't have been built this way at all. Completed in 1993, it was the brainchild of architect Hiroshi Hara, who wanted to design a floating city in the sky. These 2 towers rise 173 meters or 568 feet and are joined only at the top by a 39th and 40th floor known as the Floating Garden Observatory. But here's where it gets terrifying. There's nothing but air between the buildings for the first 170 meters. There's no lower connections, no core spine uniting the two towers. They're just two separate buildings leaning inward slightly, trying to keep a 60-meter wide steel ring balanced at the top. Structurally, this design makes the building incredibly vulnerable to lateral forces, namely earthquakes and wind shear. With no connecting podium or lower-level brace, the two towers move independently, but the top structure has to stay perfectly aligned or risk catastrophic failure. The risks aren't theoretical either. In 1995, just 2 years after opening, the Great Hanshin earthquake struck Kobe, less than 40 kilometers from Osaka. The Umeda Sky Building survived, but minor structural inspections afterward revealed lateral stress tension. Several of the interior glass panels had cracked, and the external escalators, already sources of vertigo, were temporarily closed. And speaking of those escalators, they may be the scariest part of the entire structure. Visitors ascend from the 35th to the 39th floor through two entirely glass-enclosed escalators suspended over the open air between the towers. There's no support columns underneath, and as you ride, you can see the streets of Osaka hundreds of feet below the transparent floors and walls. Critics at the time called it reckless. Today, it's called miraculous. That it never suffered a major failure is astounding, and that it hasn't been redesigned, reinforced, or torn down is almost disturbing. But maybe that's part of the magic, the idea that something this obviously dangerous can be beautiful, and yet somehow still exist. It shouldn't be standing, but it is. Number 1. The Hanging Temple of Hengshan in China. If you were to trek through the canyons of the Shanxi province in northern China and suddenly glimpse a building hovering halfway up a cliff, you might think your eyes were playing tricks on you. Clinging impossibly to a rock face more than 75 meters above a riverbed, the Hanging Temple looks like something straight out of a legend. It's a series of halls, shrines, and walkways suspended in midair, supported only by wooden stilts anchored into the stone. And the most unbelievable part of this, the structure is over 1,500 years old. Constructed during the Northern Wei Dynasty, sometime around 491 CE, the Hanging Temple was built by a single monk named Lao Ran, who, according to tradition, sought solitude and spiritual elevation. What he created became one of the most astonishing feats of ancient architecture in Asia, and a structure that still puzzles modern engineers. The fact that the Hanging Temple remains intact and accessible in the 21st century, despite being made of wood, stone, and gravity-defying logic, is nothing short of amazing. Still, this is not how architecture is supposed to work. Normally, load-bearing structures require firm foundations, lateral bracing, and redundant supports. The Hanging Temple has none of that. Its supporting stilts, some of which are no thicker than a telephone pole, rest on ledges of rock that erode every year from the wind and sun. Yet the temple has survived every earthquake, war, dynasty collapse, and environmental disaster thrown its way for over a millennium. How? Well, part of the answer lies in the placement. It's located beneath a natural stone overhang, which protects it from rain, snow, and falling debris. But that doesn't explain everything. When Chinese engineers surveyed the structure in the 20th century, they discovered no uniform blueprint. The temple had been expanded gradually, and much of it was improvised. More than 40 halls, walkways, and pavilions are connected by narrow bridges and corridors, and each one slightly offset to manage weight. There's no single central pillar. Instead, the structure distributes load through multiple contact points, like a spider web attached to a cliff. The government of China declared the whole Hanging Temple a key cultural relic in the 1980s, and preservation efforts have been cautious. There's no elevators, no protective domes, no climate control systems, and to visit it is to step into a living relic, one that still functions as a place of worship. But how long can it last is the question. Experts warn that the rock in which the temple is anchored is slowly eroding. The wooden beams, though periodically replaced, are vulnerable to insects and rot. A single large quake could bring the entire thing down, not just the exposed walkways, but the embedded core. And yet, every year, it holds firm. It's not supposed to, but it does. In a world where modern buildings can collapse from minor flaws and steel towers need constant reinforcement, the Hanging Temple defies every rule. It is precarious by design, enduring by accident, and eternal by will. It should have fallen 1,000 times, but it hasn't. It endures.